The average price for a new vehicle in the US is now above $50,000 for the first time ever, according to Kelley Blue Book, which noted the all-time high pricing has not stopped electric vehicle sales from soaring. Average transaction prices for new vehicles hit $50,080 in September, the report released Monday found, rising 2.1% from August and 3.6% year over year.
U.S. consumers are about to learn a hard truth. When Washington tears up decades of auto cooperation with Canada, the bill doesn't land in Ottawa, it lands right in American driveways. Prices are rising, supply chains are buckling, and the era of seamless North American auto production is slipping away. And the twist that no one expected is that Canada may emerge from this disruption in a far stronger position than many imagined. Today, we break down the fallout of the collapsing Auto Pact, why Americans are paying more for their vehicles, why Donald Trump's tariff strategy is backfiring, and how Canada is quietly positioning itself as the stable center of gravity in a fractured North American market. In early 2025, President Donald Trump pushed forward with a sweeping series of tariffs on imported vehicles and auto parts coming from Canada and Mexico. Verified by Reuters reporting, the White House framed the move as a jobs-first reshoring strategy meant to force automakers to expand domestic production inside the United States. But instead of boosting American factories, the tariffs detonated a supply chain crisis that ripped through a deeply integrated industry. For decades, a car assembled in Ontario might rely on engines from Michigan, sensors from Mexico, transmissions cast in Windsor, and software coded in Waterloo. These components crossed borders multiple times before a finished car ever reached a dealership. It was an ecosystem built on efficiency, trust, and open borders. Trump's tariff wall shattered that ecosystem in an instant. Parts that once flowed effortlessly are now slowed by inspections, duties, and unpredictable cost surges. U.S. factories that depend on Canadian-made components are scaling back shifts. Automakers warned that Americans could soon pay $5,000 to $15,000 more for certain vehicles, a figure widely cited in Bloomberg and Reuters industry analysis. Meanwhile, Ottawa's reaction was swift and strategic. Prime Minister Mark Carney announced that the tariffs mark the end of deep economic integration with the United States, signaling that Canada is no longer willing to accept instability as the price of partnership. The Auto Pact didn't just weaken, it effectively collapsed.
The consequences inside the United States are hitting faster and harder than Washington expected. Prices on dealership lots are rising. Inventories are thinning out as factories struggle to secure the Canadian and Mexican components they relied on for decades. Even companies considered resilient, like Tesla and Ford, now acknowledge higher production costs tied directly to cross-border disruption. The irony is glaring. Tariffs were supposed to protect American auto workers, yet the bottlenecks they created are causing slowdowns and potential layoffs. Confidential industry briefings referenced by Reuters show a quiet admission across Detroit. The Canadian supply chain cannot be reproduced overnight. Replacing it with purely domestic inputs is not realistic without billions in new investment and many years of rebuilding. In other words, the United States engineered a crisis it was never prepared to manage. And within Washington, there is growing recognition that this approach has boxed America in. Lawmakers privately concede the U.S. overestimated its capacity to go it alone while underestimating Canada's central role in advanced manufacturing. The result is a political narrative collapsing under economic reality.
Canada's response stands in stark contrast. Rather than panic, the Carney government treated the crisis as an opportunity to pivot. Ottawa accelerated trade diversification, expanding negotiations with Europe, Japan, South Korea, and ASEAN to open new markets for Canadian auto parts and EV technologies. At the same time, Canada rolled out powerful industrial incentives, including clean manufacturing tax credits, productivity superdeductions, and fast-track approvals for large-scale battery and critical mineral projects. The message to global automakers was simple. If you need stability, predictability, and access to clean energy, Canada is the place to build. While the U.S. is tied up in constitutional lawsuits over Trump's emergency tariff powers, Canada is offering certainty, and global automakers are paying attention. Several are now reevaluating long-term North American investment plans, asking, for the first time in decades, whether Canada is the safer and more profitable bet. Executives visiting Ottawa in recent months have described Canada as the Switzerland of North American manufacturing, a jurisdiction where policy doesn't swing wildly with every election cycle. That perception alone is shifting billions in future capital allocation. This isn't just a trade story, it's a geopolitical shift. For years, Washington assumed Canada needed the United States more than the United States needed Canada. But the supply chain chaos triggered by the tariffs has revealed the opposite. American manufacturing is deeply dependent on Canadian engineering, minerals, and components. Canada, meanwhile, has options. With deepening ties to South Korea, Japan, the EU, and emerging Indo-Pacific partners, confirmed by multiple analyses across CBC and Reuters, Ottawa is designing a new economic architecture that is less reliant on America's political mood swings. Trump may have intended to pressure Canada into concessions, but the result is that Canada is now accelerating its path toward independence and diversification. The fundamental reason American buyers feel the consequences more sharply is structural. U.S. consumers purchase more imported vehicles per capita than Canadians, and U.S. automakers depend more heavily on Canadian components than the reverse. Canada's diversified export network gives it room to maneuver, while U.S. buyers are locked into a market suddenly constrained by tariffs. And where Ottawa has responded with coordinated policy action, Washington's approach has been reactive, fragmented, and politically volatile. In short, when the Auto Pact breaks, Canada shifts sideways. The United States gets hit head-on. What we are witnessing is the flipping of a long-standing assumption. For decades, the U.S. believed it held all the leverage in North American manufacturing. Yet, as supply chains fracture and prices soar, it is Canada, with its minerals, clean energy, advanced manufacturing, and global trade links, that now looks like the indispensable partner. By deepening alliances with the Indo-Pacific and the EU, and by securing new industrial investments, Canada is no longer reacting to U.S. decisions. It is charting its own path. Trump's tariffs were meant to strengthen America's hand. Instead, they strengthened Canada's resolve. The fallout from the collapsing Auto Pact is more than an economic disruption. It is a strategic turning point. American consumers are paying higher prices, U.S. factories are scrambling for parts, and Canada, long seen as the junior partner in the North American auto economy, is now emerging as a stable, credible, and increasingly influential player. As we move closer to the 2026 USMCA review, one question now hangs over the continent. If this is what happens when the U.S. chooses confrontation, what happens when Canada finally decides it no longer needs to play by America's script?
China is clearly the leader. My own research, for example, shows that China generates automotive patents and have for the past decade at a rate of about 5-to-1 over the US. There's nothing about the US auto industry that suggests that it is going to be a global leader going forward.
Canada just crossed a line that almost no country has dared to cross in front of Donald Trump's political shadow, and it did so calmly, strategically, and with full confidence in its own future. While American automakers struggle under Trump's tariffs and collapsing production, Canada is openly debating something that would have been unthinkable 10 years ago, pivoting toward China's ascendant electric vehicle industry and stepping away from the U.S. auto giants that once dictated the direction of this country. What makes this moment historic is not the shift itself, but the attitude behind it. Ottawa is no longer reacting out of fear or economic dependence. For the first time in decades, Canada sees the U.S. auto industry not as an anchor for stability, but as a risk, a sector falling behind in technology, supply chains, and global competitiveness. And that realization is sending shockwaves through Washington. The turning point began when Stellantis abruptly pulled its Jeep Compass production out of Brampton and moved it to the United States. Instead of silently accepting the decision, Ottawa launched a formal dispute resolution process, a rare and unusually assertive move that signals a new posture toward American automakers. In another era, Canada would have swallowed the loss, not this time. At the same moment, the U.S.-China trade war escalated to one of its most volatile phases in years. Washington's new tariffs on Chinese EVs and components pushed U.S. automakers into deeper instability. Reuters reported that production cuts across American plants reached levels as high as 20,000 vehicles per day, creating ripples throughout North American supply chains. Against this backdrop, Canada quietly reopened high-level diplomatic channels with Beijing. After Prime Minister Mark Carney met President Xi Jinping at APEC 2025, China restored Canada to its approved travel list and signaled openness to resolving long-standing disputes on canola and, crucially, on electric vehicles. At the same time, experts like Professor Greg Mordew of McMaster University began stating openly that China, not the United States, is now the global leader in automotive technology and patent production. His conclusion was blunt. If Canada wants a competitive automotive future, it must engage with the world's new center of innovation. That statement landed like a thunderclap in U.S. political circles.
And there's nothing about the U.S. industrial policy measures or the energy policy measures that suggest that continuing to try to tether our industry to the U.S. industry is the best bet.
For more than half a century, the U.S. enjoyed unquestioned dominance over the Canadian auto sector. But that dominance is cracking, not because Canada is turning away, but because the U.S. industry is losing its competitive edge. Under Trump's second-term tariff regime, supply chains have become unpredictable, costs have surged, and manufacturers across the U.S. have warned of significant production risks. Detroit, once the world's automotive powerhouse, is no longer setting the pace. Meanwhile, China is producing nearly 10 million electric vehicles annually, outpacing the US, Europe, and Japan combined. It files 5 times more automotive patents than the United States every single year. And while Washington pours billions into protectionism, Beijing pours billions into research, scale, and next-generation technology. Canada is watching this divergence closely, and the conclusion is becoming undeniable. The future of global automotive leadership is emerging in Asia, not America. What Canada is recognizing today is an economic truth that industry insiders have understood for a long time. The U.S. is no longer the world leader in cars, batteries, or electrification. North America's EV adoption is moving slower than Europe and dramatically slower than China. American automakers, facing tariff wars and political uncertainty, are cutting production, delaying EV investments, and shifting manufacturing strategies month by month. For Canada, this creates a dangerous dependency. If the U.S. continues to fall behind, Canada, historically tied to U.S. auto cycles, risks being dragged down with it. That's why Carney's government is reconsidering old assumptions and looking for partners who can actually support Canada's long-term industrial goals. Partnering with China does not mean embracing China politically. It means recognizing where the innovation is, where the engineering is advancing fastest, and where the automotive future is genuinely being built. This is not an ideological shift. It is a strategic one. No move threatens Trump more than the idea of Canada buying EVs from China instead of the United States. For decades, American automakers have relied on Canada as their stabilizing market, a guaranteed customer base that absorbed inventory and helped offset domestic downturns. But if Chinese EVs enter Canada at lower prices, with superior range, and with technology that U.S. automakers are still years away from matching, that entire model collapses. Such a shift would break the American monopoly overnight. It would lower vehicle prices across Canada, shift supply chains toward Asia, and undermine Trump's leverage in every trade negotiation. Trump has already floated the idea of 100% tariffs on Chinese imports, hoping to pressure Canada into resisting Chinese EVs. But the reality is that Canada is done letting Washington dictate what technologies it can or cannot adopt. The tariff chaos of 2025 made that perfectly clear. Trump broke the auto system that once sustained North America. Canada is now building something new.
Prime Minister Mark Carney has been consistent from the beginning. Canada will not chain its future to a declining industrial model. Instead, it will choose partnerships based on innovation, resilience, and Canadian national interest. By re-engaging with China, strengthening ties with Europe, and looking to ASEAN for growth, Canada is reshaping itself into a globally connected middle power, not an appendage of American industrial strategy. This is one of the first times a close U.S. ally has taken such an explicit step toward industrial independence. And, ironically, it was Trump's own economic aggression that pushed Canada in this direction. Canada is no longer asking what Washington wants. It is asking what Canada needs. That shift in mindset is powerful. It is also irreversible.
Canada is not choosing China over the United States. It is choosing the future over the past. By exploring Chinese EV partnerships, challenging Stellantis, and refusing to let Trump dictate the terms of North American manufacturing, Canada is stepping into a new era of sovereignty, confident, self-directed, and globally engaged. The real question now is how far this pivot will go. Will Canada open the door fully to Chinese EVs and break a century-long dependency on Detroit? Will Trump escalate further? Or will the U.S. finally confront its own industrial stagnation? And above all, is this the moment Canada begins building an automotive future defined not by American expectations, but by Canadian ambition?
As Prime Minister, my number one focus is to put Canadians back in control by building here at home and building new partnerships abroad, so that we're not reliant on the United States.
I think that Canada is starting to realize that overall we made a mistake in putting ourselves in lockstep with the Americans. You put all your eggs in one basket and then you have a Trump who just decides to throw the basket on the floor, then you're in trouble. And that's where we are right now.
In Gyeongju, South Korea, as cameras flashed across the APEC summit, something subtle but historic unfolded. Canada was no longer standing in the background of great power diplomacy. Its place among Asia's economic leaders had been earned. For years, Canadian delegations attended these forums as quiet observers, often overshadowed by larger economies. But this time, the tone was different. Behind that shift is a decade of patient work, building trust, strengthening regional links, and proving reliability in a world where those qualities are becoming rare. When Prime Minister Mark Carney met leaders from Malaysia, Singapore, and South Korea, it wasn't a courtesy call. It was the result of credibility accumulated through consistent policy, calm diplomacy, and the promise that Canada delivers on what it says. Across Asia's meeting halls, Canada was recognized not for its size, but for something more valuable, a reputation that travels farther than geography.
In today's fractured global economy, reputation has become a form of currency. When investors and governments look for partners who honor their word, reliability outweighs raw power. Canada's credibility has turned into its greatest export. Business councils across Southeast Asia describe Canada as a safe pair of hands, a country that keeps its markets open and its policies predictable even when others turn inward. The Canada-ASEAN Business Council, which has worked for more than 10 years to deepen economic ties, says that the groundwork is finally paying off. In 2024, trade between Canada and the Indo-Pacific region reached roughly $260 billion, according to Statistics Canada. Still far smaller than the $1.3 trillion Canada exchanges with the United States, but rising every quarter. What matters is the direction of travel. Canada is expanding where global growth is strongest and where long-term partnerships can be built on trust rather than turbulence. Reputation, once an abstract ideal, is now measurable in deals signed, meetings held, and markets opened.
Prime Minister Carney's whirlwind tour of Malaysia, Singapore, and South Korea symbolized that new reality. In Kuala Lumpur, he he met with ASEAN business leaders and described a world in transition, one where reliability counts more than rhetoric. His message resonated. For nations balancing between major powers, Canada offers a middle path: open trade without political strings, cooperation without confrontation. The numbers support this pivot. ASEAN, a bloc of 10 nations with more than 660 million people, is projected by the International Monetary Fund to be one of the fastest-growing regions through 2040. Over the past decade, Canadian firms have expanded quietly there in mining, agri-food, and clean energy projects that emphasize transparency and environmental standards. Carney's diplomacy is not about grandstanding. It is about planting flags of trust in economies that will define the next generation of global growth. Each handshake in Asia is a reminder that reputation built at home can open doors abroad.
It's our country, it's your future, and we are going to give it back to you.
Back in Ottawa, Carney's national address captured the deeper philosophy guiding this shift. "This is our country," he said. "It's your future." The speech wasn't about isolation, it was about self-reliance. For decades, Canada's prosperity was tied almost entirely to the United States. When the American economy stumbled, so did Canada's. Carney's goal is to break that dependency by strengthening what he calls the nation's economic sovereignty. His plan is straightforward, but ambitious. Federal spending will be restrained to free resources for what truly drives productivity: homes, ports, electricity grids, and industrial corridors that move goods to the world. The government aims to rebuild domestic capacity in steel, aluminum, and technology manufacturing. Today, only about 40% of the steel purchased in Canada is produced domestically, according to the Canadian Steel Producers Association. Carney's target is to lift that share through Buy Canadian procurement rules and incentives for local producers. The principle is clear: a country that builds at home earns respect abroad. A nation confident in its own capacity can negotiate globally from strength, not dependence. Canada's growing presence in Asia reflects more than trade policy. It signals a transformation in national identity. The country once viewed itself mainly as America's reliable neighbor. Now it is becoming a reliable partner to the world. Analysts point to the consistency of Canadian diplomacy: measured language, predictable regulation, and a willingness to mediate rather than polarize. Asian governments appreciate a partner that does not force them to choose sides. In places like Vietnam, the Philippines, and Indonesia, Canadian investment focuses on long-term industries, education, critical minerals, and infrastructure, areas that create shared value instead of dependency. The credibility of this approach rests heavily on leadership. Carney's background as a central banker and global economic advisor gives him unusual authority in financial and diplomatic circles. His command of detail, combined with a calm temperament, has made Canada's arguments carry weight far beyond its size. This influence wasn't inherited. It was earned through years of steady engagement, the same way Canada earned its seat at the Asian summit tables, where decisions about the next global economy are being shaped.
Across the Pacific, Canada's reputation now carries a quiet strength. It is the strength of a nation that listens before it speaks, delivers before it promises, and builds before it boasts. The story unfolding is larger than a single trip or trade announcement. It is about a country redefining what leadership looks like in the 21st century. While others respond to uncertainty with fear, Canada responds with construction, with ports, power grids, and industries that connect its resources to global markets. The government's plan to double non-U.S. exports within the next decade may sound bold, but it fits the pattern of a nation betting on its own potential. This moment is not just economic, it is cultural and civic. Canadians are being asked to believe again in their collective capability, to see that national independence is not declared, it is demonstrated. Every policy that invests in Canadian workers, every partnership that builds mutual trust, adds another brick to that foundation. In this sense, Carney's message rings deeper than politics. The future of Canada will not be decided elsewhere. It will be built piece by piece, by Canadians themselves. And as the world searches for steady hands in uncertain times, Canada's example is beginning to stand out, not because it is loud, but because it is consistent. Its place at the table has been earned, its reputation continues to open doors, and its people are proving that a nation that believes in itself can shape not only its own destiny, but also a more balanced world around it.
Mr. Carney, you leaving Washington with a deal on tariffs.
I think they're going to be very happy. We have a lot of things that we're working on that people don't talk about. They talk about, competitiveness. She's a very competitive person. And they talk about things that we don't necessarily agree on. But I think they're going to walk away very happy. I think so.
In Washington, the cameras caught a familiar scene: the handshake, the smiles, the flags. But what surprised everyone wasn't the setting, it was the mood. For months, relations between Canada and the United States had been tense, defined by tariffs and frustration. Yet this time, President Donald Trump looked relaxed. He spoke warmly about Canada and hinted that something positive was coming. Beside him, Prime Minister Mark Carney responded with calm confidence. He reminded Americans that Canada is their second-largest trading partner and their biggest foreign investor. The message was clear. Canada is not a junior partner, it is an essential pillar of North America's economy. Trump predicted that Canada would be happy. Carney called the two countries stronger together. Behind those short remarks was a bigger story, a subtle shift in power. What began as a trade war built on pressure and threats is now turning into a lesson in patience, leverage, and quiet strategy.
There are areas, as the president just said, where conflict, maybe not so much conflict, we compete. There are areas where we compete, and it's in those areas where we have to come to an agreement that works. But there are more areas where we are stronger together, and that's what we're focused on. And we're going to get the right deal for America, right deal, obviously, from my perspective, for Canada.
Carney did not come to Washington to plead for relief. He came to remind the U.S. how deeply the two economies are connected. Canada is the second-largest trading partner of the United States and its largest foreign investor. In the past 5 years alone, Canadian businesses invested over $500 billion south of the border. And if stability returns, that figure could multiply in the next decade. Every major U.S. industry depends on Canadian inputs. Aluminum from Quebec powers aircraft parts in Ohio. Steel from Ontario frames cars in Michigan. Electricity from Canada keeps factories running in New York and Minnesota. Carney tied every number to a shared benefit, making clear that what hurts Canada also hurts American industry. Across the Great Lakes states, governors have echoed that point. Their regional economies depend on cross-border manufacturing and energy trade worth more than $60 billion each year. Many have urged the White House to ease tariffs because local factories cannot absorb higher costs. That frustration gave Carney proof that Trump's tariffs were backfiring inside the U.S. itself. Rather than confront Trump directly, Carney used calm, data, and tone. He spoke about deals that work for both nations, focusing on competitiveness, not conflict. It was a message Trump understood. Kellyanne Shaw, the former White House trade advisor, later said Carney was building natural chemistry. But in truth, it was strategy. Carney knew that Trump values personal rapport as much as policy. That diplomacy began to pay off. For the first time since the tariff conflict began, Trump described Canada as a valued partner instead of a trade problem. The change was small but meaningful. Trump's tone changed because his policy is hitting its own limits. When he launched tariffs under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, he aimed to punish trade partners and boost U.S. production. Instead, costs climbed and business confidence weakened. Canada's role in that equation is critical. U.S. automakers source up to 40% of their parts from Canadian plants. When tariffs raised material costs, production in Michigan and Ohio slowed. Construction firms reported higher prices for aluminum and lumber. Even cabinet and furniture makers, once supportive of tariffs, warned they could face price increases of up to 20% by early 2026. The tariffs meant to protect American jobs are now threatening them. That reality forced Trump to soften his language. In front of cameras, he spoke warmly about Canada and hinted at something positive to come. His America First rhetoric suddenly carried a note of cooperation. The White House needed that shift. The administration was already dealing with a budget stalemate and rising inflation. Alienating Canada further risked cutting off supply chains that feed American factories. Governors from Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota have warned that continuing tariffs could lead to layoffs before the Christmas quarter. In this environment, Carney's composure worked. His visit gave Trump a moment of stability and diplomacy, while Washington looked divided. Both leaders left with political cover, but Canada left stronger. There were no new tariffs, no escalation, and for once, restraint from a president who thrives on confrontation.
My takeaway from this bilateral meeting was very much an American first tone as well as a Canada first tone coming out from both leaders saying, look, we have a really important relationship, one of the largest trading relationships in the world. We are the closest of allies and friends, but we are also competitors when it comes to some of these key sectors. And I think the relationship between nation states is complicated, and both of those things can be true at the same time.
The real gain from the October meeting was not a signed deal, but a new tone. Carney secured a technical channel for ongoing talks on steel, aluminum, autos, and lumber. In trade diplomacy, keeping that dialogue alive means influence. It gives Canada a voice before the 2026 USMCA review even begins. While Trump seeks short-term victories abroad, Carney is playing the long game. He suspended the digital services tax and scaled back counter-tariffs before the visit. Small moves that reopened communication. For investors, that stability has already shown results. The Toronto Stock Exchange rose modestly after the trip, driven by industrial and energy shares tied to U.S. trade. Domestically, Carney gained breathing room. His critics at home had accused him of failing to deliver results. After the meeting, Trump himself praised his negotiating skills, which strengthened Carney's credibility. He now appears steady and patient, guiding Canada through turbulence without confrontation. Beyond Washington, Canada is building influence through its provinces. The premiers of Ontario and Quebec continue working with U.S. governors in the Great Lakes region, forming a cross-border coalition of economic allies. These local ties, built through decades of trade and shared industries, have become Canada's quiet power base. They give Ottawa indirect sway inside the U.S. political system, bypassing the volatility of federal politics. The October visit therefore marks the start of a new phase, one where Canada negotiates from endurance, not desperation. Trump's tariffs were meant to show American dominance, but they revealed America's dependence. The more Washington raised barriers, the more U.S. businesses felt the pain. Prices climbed, governors protested, and pressure for cooperation grew. For Canada, this is a quiet victory. It did not come through confrontation or slogans, but through persistence. Carney turned a hostile policy into a reminder that the prosperity of both countries is intertwined. He avoided escalation, kept economic dialogue alive, and positioned Canada ahead of the next trade review. The meeting ended without signatures, but it changed the story. The world saw a U.S. president softening his stance and a Canadian leader who refused to bow yet earned respect. In diplomacy, that shift matters more than any paper deal. Trump once tried to make Canada bend. Instead, he gave Ottawa the leverage it needed to rise.